Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You can't wear white, my sister Lisa said, her voice laced with that same syrupy venom she's always reserved just for me, the kind of tone that masks insult in the disguise of tradition. It's for women who haven't shamed the family. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She said it right there in front of our mother, two cousins I hadn't seen since our grandma's funeral, and her fiancé's law firm friends, one of whom audibly choked on his drink when she said it. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just nodded, smiled, took another sip of my sparkling water, and said, "Of course, wouldn't dream of it." And that was that. Except it wasn't, not really, because I'd spent years training myself to stay still in the face of disrespect, to not rise to bait, to let snide remarks slide off like rain off waxed armor. But that night, something in me shifted. Maybe it was the dismissive way she turned back to her wine glass like I was already fading from her peripheral vision. Or maybe it was the silence around the table, the kind that settles in when everyone knows a line's been crossed, but no one's brave enough to say it out loud. Whatever it was, I felt my stomach coil into something hard and resolute. And it wasn't shame, it was fury, cold, slow-burning fury that I'd gotten real good at carrying over long distances. The rehearsal dinner was held in one of those dimly lit, over-designed, barn-chic wineries just outside Santa Barbara, the kind where every table centerpiece has to involve lavender and overpriced driftwood, and where even the cheese boards feel like they're judging you. I had flown in that morning, not because I wanted to come, but because I felt like not showing up would only reinforce the family's narrative, Lisa's narrative, that I was still the same reckless girl who'd run off to join the army and left real responsibilities behind. Funny how they saw my deployments as running away, while Lisa going to Europe with Dad's credit card for a year after college was called finding herself. It didn't matter that I was a decorated logistics officer, that I'd served in 2 continents, that I'd been promoted ahead of schedule, or that my team once drove 500 miles across hostile terrain to deliver critical aid. None of that counted when your mother still calls your job that thing you do in uniform, and your sister treats your medals like costume jewelry. Lisa looked every bit the bride-to-be, flawless makeup, expertly curled hair, that annoying half-smile she'd perfected since high school that says, "You'll never quite measure up, but I'll pretend you might someday." She clinked glasses with guests, laughed with her soon-to-be in-laws, and avoided eye contact with me like I might stain the air around her. I mostly stayed quiet. I made small talk with a couple of old relatives, one of whom thought I still worked in the army office. I laughed politely, answered their awkward questions, and kept my tone light even when someone mentioned how brave it was of me to choose a path like that, as if courage had anything to do with escaping a house where worth was measured in whiteness, weddings, and whether you showed enough cleavage at brunch to attract a man with a real job. At one point during the dessert course, Lisa leaned over and whispered, "You'll be sitting at table 9 with the singles and the, fringe guests." She said it like she was doing me a favor, like she'd spared me the indignity of sitting with the people who might ask why I hadn't brought a date, or, God forbid, a husband. I smiled again. I'd gotten very good at smiling. I think it annoyed her that I never gave her the satisfaction of snapping back. But as the evening wore on and the wine kept flowing, I noticed something interesting. Lisa's fiancé, Mark, kept sneaking glances at me, not in a flirty way, not even in a curious one. It was more like someone trying to make sure the landmine he knows he buried hasn't started ticking. The few times we did make eye contact, he'd offer this half-apologetic smirk, the kind people give when they're too cowardly to stop a wrong, but too aware to enjoy it guilt-free. Then, as guests began to gather their coats and say their farewells, I headed toward the back exit to avoid yet another awkward hug from someone who'd probably asked, "So when are you leaving the military?" at least 3 times already. That's when I heard them, Lisa and Mark, standing just around the corner by the restrooms. "I still think she's going to cause something," Mark said, low and annoyed. "She won't," Lisa replied dismissively. "She knows she's outnumbered. Besides, if she does, it'll just prove my point." "Still," he muttered, "maybe you shouldn't have said that thing about the white dress." There was a pause, And then Lisa's voice, cool and clipped. She's lucky I even invited her. I stood still, barely breathing. I didn't need to hear more. I turned and walked outside, the night air hitting me like a slap. And still, I smiled. Because in that moment, I knew exactly what I was going to wear to the wedding. And it sure as hell wasn't going to be white. The next morning started like most mornings when I'm back in California. Early, restless, and weighed down by the thick, invisible heaviness that only returns when I'm near the house I once called home. I had stayed the night at a mid-range hotel 10 miles out of town, not because I had to, but because sleeping under my mother's roof felt like wearing a suit 2 sizes too small, tight in all the wrong places and impossible to breathe in. The kind of tightness that forces you to remember you don't quite belong anymore, and maybe never really did. The sun was barely up when I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through the unread messages I had ignored the night before. Mostly spam and a handful of half-hearted good to see you texts from relatives whose names I barely remembered. There was one from my younger cousin Erin, a nurse in Sacramento I hadn't spoken to in over a year, who wrote, "That comment Lisa made was out of line, just saying." I stared at it for a full minute before typing thanks and deleting it before hitting send. Because what was the point, really? No one was going to say anything to Lisa. They never did. I threw on some jeans and a sweatshirt, grabbed a coffee from the lobby, and made the drive toward my mother's house. That same beige 2-story colonial with the dying roses out front and the chipped paint near the windows that Dad never bothered to fix. The driveway looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just spent too much time navigating Humvees and convoys and airstrips. Either way, I sat in the car for a good 5 minutes, just watching the front door like it might do something. It didn't. Mom answered on the third knock, still in her robe, hair pulled back in a tight bun that only accentuated how little her expressions had changed over the years. Tight-lipped, always evaluating, always trying to figure out what you were hiding and how it might reflect on her. She barely said hello before stepping aside to let me in, and I could feel the tension crawling up my neck like ivy the moment I crossed the threshold. The house smelled like old lavender and lemon cleaner, a scent that used to mean company's coming, but now just smelled like pretense. I followed her into the kitchen, where she poured herself a cup of tea and offered me nothing. She didn't ask why I was there. She didn't ask how I'd slept. Instead, she went straight for it, like a surgeon with a dull scalpel. "Lisa told me what happened at the dinner," she said, voice flat. "I hope you don't plan to make a scene at the wedding." It wasn't a question. It never was with her. I kept my tone even, unbothered. I'm not the one making scenes. She gave me a long look, the kind that tried to read all the things I wasn't saying. "You've always liked being the center of attention, even if it means dragging the rest of us into your mess." I almost laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned against the counter and asked, "Is that why you said Dad was disappointed in me last night?" Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, but she didn't deny it. "You know what he wanted for you." "Yeah," I said louder now, "to be Lisa." And there it was, the ugly truth that had always lingered beneath our conversations like a bad smell. My sister was the blueprint, the benchmark, the golden child with the perfect teeth, the steady fiancé, the house she didn't pay for, and the wedding that was turning into a Broadway production. And me, I was the one who left, who wore boots instead of heels, who learned to sleep with one eye open and didn't flinch at sirens anymore. I was the daughter they told stories about in past tense. Mom didn't say anything. She just sipped her tea and turned back to the sink, like the conversation was already over. Later that afternoon, I drove back to the hotel, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I had barely kicked off my shoes when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Lisa. No greeting, no smiley face. Just 5 words. "Hope you're coming Thursday. XO." It was meant to sound polite. It wasn't. It was a warning. She wanted me there, but only so she could control the narrative, keep up appearances, because if I didn't show up, I'd be the disgrace who couldn't even be civil. If I did show up, she'd get to posture her superiority in front of every guest who'd been fed stories about the rebellious sister who'd run off to play soldier. I ignored it. Instead, I sat down and began going through my gear, slowly, methodically, checking that every piece was clean, pressed, and intact. My Army service uniform, dark blue with gold piping, medals aligned perfectly above the heart. Insignia polished until they caught the light like glass. I hadn't worn it since the last ceremony, the one where my CO had handed me that bronze star and told me I'd done something no one else had the guts to. That moment had meant something. It still did. I wasn't planning on wearing white, but I wasn't planning on disappearing either. Then, just as I was about to zip the garment bag closed, there was a knock at the hotel door. A quiet, deliberate knock. Not the kind from housekeeping. I opened it to find no one standing there, but on the ground was a simple cardboard box, no return label. Just my name, written in bold, rushed handwriting I recognized instantly. I took it inside, opened the lid, and there it was. A white veil, simple, sheer, untouched. Underneath, an invitation card with Lisa's name embossed in gold, and scrawled beneath it, in that same handwriting, "Come as something else." I held the veil up to the light, felt the fabric between my fingers, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel confused. I felt certain. They didn't want me to wear white, but they damn well weren't ready for what I was going to wear instead. The day of the wedding came quicker than I thought it would, not because I had lost track of time, but because there's something about anticipating a moment of reckoning that makes every hour feel like it's building toward a collision you can't stop. I woke up before the alarm, which was set for 5:30, my body conditioned by years of morning drills and tight schedules, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of uncertainty or hesitation clawing at the edges of my thoughts. Instead, I felt ready, composed, focused in that eerie, quiet way that only comes when you know exactly who you are and you're walking into a room full of people who never really did. I dressed carefully, not in the way you dress for a wedding or a dinner party or a chance to impress someone new, but with the practiced precision of someone who understands that clothing can be armor, that how you present yourself can be a weapon as sharp as any blade. And today, I needed every inch of that protection. I pulled on my Army service uniform, smoothed out the collar, adjusted the waist, double-checked the arrangement of every ribbon and pin, and made sure the medals were not only centered and aligned but gleaming, intentionally so. There was no modesty in how I chose to wear that uniform today. I wasn't here to blend in or to be polite. I was here to remind them all, every single one of them, what they had chosen to forget, to ignore, to bury under passive-aggressive comments and backhanded invitations. The ride to the venue was long, a winding stretch of road through vineyards and upscale ranch houses with decorative stone signs and mailboxes that cost more than some people's rent. I kept the windows up, the AC low, and my thoughts even lower, grounding myself in the familiar rigidity of posture, the way the belt sat tight at my waist, the soft pressure of the metals tapping against my chest as the car turned. Every movement reminded me that this wasn't about pettiness or theatrics or even the burning anger I still carried from that dinner. It was about showing up when it mattered. It was about reclaiming space that had been denied to me not just this week, but over years and years of small cuts and subtle digs that accumulated into something unignorable. When I pulled into the venue's private lot, the valet stared for half a beat too long, his eyes flicking from the car to me to the badges on my chest, as if trying to figure out how to react to someone dressed like I had just walked off a parade ground and into a wedding reception. He didn't say a word, just handed me the stub and stepped back, and I walked through the entrance with my head high, heels clicking in measured rhythm, every step deliberate, every movement designed to say, "I am not here to be tolerated." The venue, a massive white barn converted into an event hall with chandeliers made of recycled wine barrels and imported French candles, was already buzzing with pre-ceremony tension. Bridesmaids in varying shades of blush pink fluttered around the entryway, clutching bouquets and water bottles, their faces painted into expressions of forced calm that told me Lisa was probably in full command mode somewhere nearby. I didn't speak to anyone right away. I just made my way toward the guest seating area, nodding politely to the few distant relatives who recognized me but weren't sure if they were supposed to. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Soft at first, hesitant, like people weren't sure whether what they were seeing was meant to be ignored or acknowledged. Some looked confused. Some looked downright scandalized. I caught my cousin Jason mouthing, "What the hell?" to his sister across the aisle. But the most satisfying reaction came from my Aunt Teresa, who saw me, did a full double take, and promptly spilled half her mimosa onto the floor. She wasn't exactly known for her subtlety, but I didn't stop walking until I reached my assigned seat. Table 9, right near the back, by the emergency exit, conveniently located next to the speakers and out of clear sight of the head table. I sat down, crossed my legs, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Mark saw me first, the groom. He was mid-conversation with one of his law school buddies when his eyes landed on me, and I watched in real time as his expression shifted from casual amusement to a kind of muted panic, like someone realizing they'd just remembered something too late. He excused himself, walked over slowly, hands in pockets, trying to look casual. You clean up well?" he said, eyes flicking again toward the medals. "Thanks," I replied, not smiling. "You too." He hesitated, looked around, then leaned in just a little. "Lisa doesn't know you're wearing that." I raised my eyebrows. "Was there a dress code on the invite?" He shook his head quickly. "No, it's not that. It's just... Look, she's been under a lot of pressure," and I cut him off with a look I'd perfected over years of field operations. The kind that said, "Save your explanations for someone who gives a damn." He trailed off, gave a tight nod, and retreated. The ceremony started soon after, and the music swelled, and Lisa appeared at the far end of the aisle in a blindingly white, custom-made designer gown that probably cost more than I made in 2 months. She looked beautiful, poised, perfect, and completely unaware, for now. But as she passed down the aisle and her eyes briefly scanned the crowd, they landed on me. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw it, the flicker of shock, the tightening of her jaw, the recognition. She kept walking. She didn't miss a step. But the ceremony had already changed. They wanted me to come quietly. Instead, I had arrived like a goddamn drumline. And the real performance was just getting started. Weddings have always felt like strange theater to me, a carefully choreographed production where everyone has their lines, their cues, their scripted moments of emotion and applause, and no one dares stray too far from what's expected, lest they disrupt the illusion that all of this, the vows, the toasts, the flowers, the overpriced cake, is more than just a spectacle crafted to tell a certain story. And today, that story was supposed to be about Lisa, the beautiful, accomplished bride finally stepping into the life she'd spent years curating, the pinnacle of every dinner table anecdote our family had recycled for decades, now tied neatly with a bow and walking down the aisle like a queen stepping onto her throne. But what Lisa hadn't accounted for, what no one had dared to predict, was the introduction of a new character into this performance, one who hadn't been written into the script, but had arrived anyway, unapologetically, and dressed not in a white dress or an off-the-rack cocktail gown, but in full ceremonial uniform, polished and deliberate and impossible to ignore. That character was meet by the time the reception rolled around. The temperature in the room had shifted in that subtle but undeniable way that happens when something unspoken hovers just beneath the surface, thick and unyielding. Guests kept glancing my way when they thought I wasn't looking, and the conversations near me carried an unnatural pitch, like people were working just a little too hard to sound unaffected. I kept mostly to myself during dinner, cutting through rubbery chicken with slow precision and sipping flat champagne I never asked for. Lisa, seated at the elevated head table surrounded by peonies and flickering votives, avoided looking in my direction with the discipline of someone who had rehearsed it. The MC, a childhood friend of Mark's, who clearly believed his future lay in wedding hosting, stepped up after the plates were cleared and began his drawn-out introductions with the flair of a cruise ship entertainer. There were toasts. The usual parade of slightly embarrassing stories from college friends, tearful anecdotes from Lisa's maid of honor, and a surprisingly long-winded blessing from Mark's uncle that bordered on sermon territory. Through it all, I stayed quiet, sipping, smiling when appropriate, nodding at the predictable punchlines. And then, as if drawn by the current itself, the MC's voice cut through. Now we have a special surprise. Lisa's sister would like to say a few words. The silence that followed was instant and cavernous, the kind that bends the air and makes people shift in their seats without realizing they're doing it. I hadn't asked to speak. I hadn't signed up for this, but someone, Lisa, maybe Mark, maybe even Mom, had decided that handing me the mic would be a way to neutralize me, to force my civility in front of witnesses, to ensure I stayed boxed in, publicly compliant. They thought if I stood in front of everyone, I'd have no choice but to play nice. They didn't know me as well as they thought they did. I rose slowly, took the microphone with a polite nod, and stepped into the soft glow of the spotlight, the hush wrapping around me like fog. My uniform caught the light in a way that made every ribbon and bar shimmer, and as I stood there, I didn't rush. I looked out over the crowd, relatives, family friends, former classmates, and then to Lisa, who held her champagne flute tightly in both hands, her knuckles pale against the stem. I won't take up too much time, I began, my voice steady but carrying easily, the kind of tone I'd perfected during briefings intense that echoed with tension. I know tonight is about celebration, about honoring the love between two people and the journey they've chosen to take together. I paused, letting the sentiment sit just long enough to be believed before continuing. I wasn't sure I'd be here tonight, not because I didn't want to support Lisa, because believe it or not, despite everything I do, but because sometimes walking into a room full of people who've already written your story for you takes more courage than walking into a battlefield. A few polite chuckles, a few people shifting in their chairs. I wasn't the daughter who got things right on the first try. I wasn't the one who wore white, or followed the path that was expected, or smiled in every family Christmas card without someone nudging me to stand straighter, tilt my head, look more appropriate. But I did choose a path, one that took me across oceans, through war zones, into the lives of people who didn't have the luxury of choosing which family member disappointed them the most. I could feel the air tightening, the weight of unspoken things pressing in from all sides. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. You told me not to wear white, I said, looking directly at Lisa now. You told me it was for women who hadn't shamed the family, and I respected that. Because I don't need white to prove I belong. I earned my colors. A few gasps. One audible, Jesus, from somewhere near the back. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the kind they use for commendations. I opened it, held it up just enough for people to see the glint inside. This medal was awarded after an operation that saved 37 civilians in a conflict zone. There was no white dress, no floral archway. Just me, my team, and the choice to stand when others couldn't. And then I did something no one expected. I walked over to Lisa's table, placed the box down gently in front of her, and said quietly but audibly, I wore this so you'd see what shame doesn't look like. She didn't speak. She didn't touch the box. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but nothing came. I turned back to the crowd, returned the microphone, and walked back to my seat without another word, the click of my heels matching the pounding silence that followed. They wanted a performance. They got one. But it wasn't the one they wrote. Weddings are supposed to end with a dance, with the clinking of glasses, with the soft blur of music and laughter, echoing beneath dim chandeliers, while guests lean into one another and whisper about the flowers, the dress, the food, the couple's future, and all the things they pretended not to notice. But this one, from the moment I placed that box down in front of Lisa, from the moment I gave them something real to look at, rather than something rehearsed, had already begun to unravel at the seams. In a way that no carefully folded napkin or monogrammed place card could fix. I didn't sit back down after the speech, at least not for long. I stood near the edge of the hall, deliberately positioning myself close to the exit, but not quite gone, watching the ripple I had sent across that polished floor take shape. The guests, many of whom had chosen to look through me just hours earlier, now darted glances at me, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, and a few with something closer to regret. Like maybe they'd missed something important and were only now realizing they had been too polite, too complicit, too cowardly to see it before. Lisa remained at the head table, frozen, her spine too straight, her fingers wrapped tightly around the flute of untouched champagne, her mouth a perfect line that trembled at the corners but refused to move. She hadn't opened the box. She hadn't touched the metal. She hadn't said a word since I placed it in front of her. And for someone who had always known what to say, what to imply, what little blade of judgment to slip between ribs without ever breaking a sweat, that silence felt louder than any outburst could have been. Mark, her new husband, shifted awkwardly beside her, glancing toward me every so often with that same look of uneasy calculation, like he was trying to decide if he should say something, do something, or simply disappear into the background until the evening reset itself and everyone forgot. But forgetting wasn't an option anymore, not after that. I stood tall in that uniform, dark blue fabric stretched crisp across my shoulders, metals gleaming under the soft amber lights of the reception hall, the white gloves in my left hand, still folded, untouched, symbolic in their own quiet way. And I waited, not for applause, not for redemption, but for the moment when I could leave on my own terms. Then, without ceremony, I reached into my small clutch and pulled out something folded in a tight square, a piece of white tulle, delicate and sheer. The veil that had arrived in that unmarked box just days before. I unfolded it slowly, letting the material drape across my hand. Like something sacred, though it hadn't been given to me with anything close to reverence. It had been sent as a warning, or a dare, or maybe a cruel joke, and I had carried it here today not as part of my outfit, but as part of my message. I stepped forward, not toward the center of the room, not toward Lisa, but to the front of the stage where the DJ had set up beside a giant floral arrangement that looked like it had been flown in from Tuscany. The music had gone quiet by then. No one had queued up the next dance. No one had returned to the microphone. And the DJ, wide-eyed and clearly unsure of whether to intervene, simply stepped back and let me have the floor. I climbed the 3 steps up to the small platform, took one long look around the room, and then held the veil high in one hand and the metal box in the other. The silence was absolute. I looked toward Lisa, who was watching now, finally watching, though her face remained unreadable. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Instead, I carefully placed the veil on the floor, opened the box once more, and removed the metal with deliberate care. Then slowly, I bent down and pinned that metal directly to the veil, right in the center, the metal catching the light like fire against snow. It was an act not of vengeance, not of malice, but of reclamation, a symbolic marriage of 2 things I had been told could never coexist: honor and shame, defiance and grace, white fabric and earned gold. I stepped back, leaving the veil there, a piece of delicate fabric now bearing the weight of something stronger than approval or tradition. It bore the truth. And then, with the entire room still watching, still waiting, I turned and walked down the steps, past the shocked DJ, past the tables of relatives and friends and strangers whose eyes followed every step, and toward the door. I didn't pause for a goodbye, or a glance, or even a moment of hesitation. My heels echoed with each step, steady and sure, a cadence I had learned on dirt roads and desert bases, a rhythm no ballroom could mute. Just as I reached the door, I stopped, not because I had second thoughts, but because I understood something about endings, how they are rarely as neat as stories demand, how they often leave things hanging, unresolved, just real enough to linger. I turned back once, just once, and let my eyes fall on the veil again, still glowing under the soft light, the metal anchored at its heart like a challenge or a question. I didn't know if Lisa would ever touch it, or if it would be thrown away, hidden, or kept in some drawer as a secret reminder of a moment she never planned for. I didn't know if anyone would talk about it after tonight, or if they'd bury it under layers of polite forgetfulness, the way they had buried me all those years. But what I did know, what I was certain of, was that no one would remember the wedding the way Lisa wanted them to. And as for me, I left with my dignity, my truth, and the sound of silence behind me. Not everyone gets the ending they imagined, but sometimes you get the one you deserve.